It's very trendy to assert that the world is flat, distance is dead, borders don't matter. But when you actually look at the data, for instance, when you focus on things that could either happen within national borders or across national borders, the cross-border component is actually pretty small. So if you look at foreign direct investment as a percentage of gross fixed capital formation around the world, that's just 10%. If you look at international phone calling minutes as a percentage of all calling minutes, that's 5% or less. And if you look at the percentage of the world's population that's accounted for by first generation immigrants, it's only 3%. One of the reasons I spend so much time explaining why people have overblown intuitions about globalization, the intent is really not to play a game of gotcha. The idea is that if we have an accurate handle on how limited globalization is, it does three things. First of all, it reminds us of the headroom for additional integration. If the world were already flat, we wouldn't have to worry about trying to conclude a global trade deal. Nothing would be gained by that. Second, it helps reverse some of the fears that exist around globalization. So, for instance, when in both the US and in Europe, when you ask people what percentage of a country's population is accounted for by first generation immigrants, you come up with answers that are 2 to 3 times on average the actual level. Pointing out the variance between people's average intuitions and the actual figures actually helps diffuse, at least based on some US studies, some of the resistance towards immigration reform, and so forth, that otherwise has tended to block progress in these respects. And third, and most importantly, from a company perspective, you're much more likely to come up with intelligent global strategies if you have a sense of what the bumps are out there that you still have to encounter rather than believing that the world is flat. So a couple of years ago, before the financial crisis, I ran a survey of readers of the Harvard Business Review, asking them to what extent they agreed with propositions about global strategy that I personally and a lot of other people regard as dubious. 40% of the respondents agreed with the notion that the highest form of global strategy is to compete exactly the same way around the world. 60+% of respondents agreed with the idea that the truly global company should aim to compete everywhere, even though the median number of countries in which a US multinational operates is 2. And finally, 88% of respondents agreed with the notion that globalization was an imperative that should not be subject to cost-benefit analysis. I think you would get very different answers to those three questions if you started with a realistic rather than an overblown assessment of how global the world actually is.